The US Secretary of State lobbies Britain once again for a ban on Huawei. Is the Chinese tech giant a threat to cybersecurity, or are there other reasons for Washington's opposition? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. The US is pressuring allies in the West to ban Huawei. The Chinese tech giant provides world-leading technology for the next generation of mobile networks called 5G. But the Trump administration has long accused Beijing of using it for spying. US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is in Britain to push the case. He wants the UK to rethink its decision to allow Huawei a limited role in building its 5G networks. Pompeo is calling for a complete ban. He says Huawei equipment could jeopardize intelligence sharing with the US and other members of the so-called Five Eyes security alliance.
Our view is fundamentally this: when you have a Chinese state-sponsored company deeply tied to the Chinese Communist Party to permit the private information of your citizens or the national security information of your citizens to transit a network that the Chinese Communist Party has the legal mandate to obtain, creates risk.
But Britain's Prime Minister says any risks can be managed.
I think it is absolutely vital that people in this country do have access to the best technology available, but that we also do absolutely nothing to imperil our relationship with the United States, to do anything to compromise our critical national security infrastructure, or to do anything to imperil our extremely valuable cooperation with Five Eyes security partners.
The UK is one of 5 English-speaking nations in an intelligence alliance known as the Five Eyes. Its decision on Huawei puts it at odds with the others. The US has imposed trade restrictions on Huawei. It's blocked American companies from dealing with it and called for the Chinese firm to be banned from 5G networks. Australia and New Zealand have followed the US in blocking Huawei. Canada has yet to decide where it stands. But it's not just the so-called Five Eyes who have security concerns. Now, while the European Union hasn't banned Huawei, it has advised member states to restrict 5G technology from what it calls high-risk suppliers. Let's bring in our panel of guests now. We have joining us in the show from Adelaide on Skype, Simon Lacey. He's a former Vice President of Global Government Affairs at Huawei Technologies in Shenzhen, China. In Preston, in the United Kingdom, we have Max Eiza. He's a lecturer in computer and network security at the University of Central Lancashire. And in Washington, D.C., Richard Weitz, a security analyst at Wikistrat. Welcome to you all. If I could start with Simon. So, Simon, why are we seeing so much global alarm over Chinese dominance of the 5G market?
Well, look, I think people are just slightly concerned about China because it has come so far, so fast. And people are just, frankly, a little bit taken aback by this new player that they're unfamiliar with and whose language and culture they don't really understand. I mean, if you think back to the 1950s when Japan joined the global trading system, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, a lot of countries were very concerned about Japan and refused to accord it MFN status, refused to trade with it on an MFN basis. So part of the concern, I think, is just the rise of this new player.
All right, let me take that point. I know there's plenty of others to discuss, but let me take that point, if I may, to Richard in Washington, D.C. Richard, is this simply a case of people don't like the new kid on the block?
Well, it's, I think, that may be a concern in that the reason that Huawei came along and started, I mean, really it was focused primarily on meeting the Chinese domestic market, and even there it was basically working through a non-traditional market, cities, rural areas, and so because it wasn't very competitive with some of the established players, But then it just rapidly rose over the past 10 to 15 years. And the two reasons people think this is the case is that, one, it received a lot of support from the Chinese government and subsidies and others. And two, there's concerns that perhaps it appropriated some Western competitors' technology and that allowed it to leapfrog and do so well. So that rise is part of the reason. Another reason is what happened to the alternative suppliers. I mean, some of them, we had very strong competitive firms in the West earlier, but for various reasons, including, I would argue, unfair competition from China, they have weakened. And this can allow Huawei to come in with a very low offering price, drive away further its competitors, and then take advantage of monopoly prices later on and other advantages.
Okay, Simon, briefly, your comeback on that. Is there not an element here of unfair competition as well as all the other concerns which the US raises?
Yeah, look, I mean, this is something that I would hear a lot when I was engaging with policymakers in places like Europe and elsewhere. And I think, this argument that Huawei received unfair support from the state, look, I just don't think that stands up to a really critical assessment. I mean, the reason why Huawei succeeded was because of the massive investments it made into R&D. But don't forget, I mean, when you're a Chinese company and you have a domestic market the size of China, that allows you to leverage unprecedented economies of scale that your competitors simply don't have. And I think that's those are the major reasons why Huawei succeeded.
All right, we'll come back to those points in a minute. Let me bring in Max, though, and let's set the stage, Max, by asking, currently, give us an idea of just how widespread Huawei technology is, how dominant it is in the global wireless 5G infrastructure market.
Well, it's fair and safe to say that Huawei is one of the biggest players in 5G technologies and 4G and 3G technologies before that. They have a big share of the market in Europe, in Asia, and even in America. And they were very quick on anticipating the market needs and developing technologies based on their experience before. I mean, take for example the UK. Huawei was involved in the UK for the last 15 years developing 3G and 4G technologies. So Huawei is in a leading position among other competitors and suppliers in 5G technologies, ranging from non-core parts like antennas and edge devices up to the core network parts. So they are, like I said, in the lead in 5G technologies.
Richard, do we have, in addition to the unfair competition, the US has security concerns about Huawei. Is there any evidence that the Chinese government actually has used Huawei to spy on others?
I mean, that's not the major concern at the moment. The Chinese have ample means of spying on others and have been very successful in doing that, which we know from other shows.
But we're hearing the U.S. Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, even talk about how intelligence sharing might be an issue with the UK precisely because of those security concerns.
Right. So, I mean, the main concern is not so much Huawei's especially able to spy. It's that if you bring them into the networks, they're going to gain access information which the existing means of Chinese intelligence gathering, human sources, and so on, will be able to acquire. You asked about evidence. It's not quite clear. The British did an extensive study and could not find any. So I think people are more concerned about what could happen in the future. You're building a new type of technology which potentially could run everything. We don't quite know if we're able to understand what kind of barriers we need to establish now to prevent that from occurring. What we do now may not make sense 5 years from now as the technology evolves. The fear is once you let the Chinese or some other non-Western competitor into these really sensitive networks and you try and differentiate between core and periphery and set up various barriers, you're just taking a big risk that you fully understand how the threat could evolve, what could be a change over time, whether you fully understand connections between this Chinese company and another Chinese company. And there's a lot of concern about how closely tied the Huawei and other Chinese companies are to the Chinese government, or at least whether whether the Chinese government, as we think, has the opportunity to go in and make decisions when needed.
Let me ask this question, Simon. Does Huawei have closer links to the Chinese government, maybe even military, compared to its Western counterparts?
Look, I actually don't think that's the case. I mean, if you do an apples to apples comparison, then you could argue that Huawei has probably closer ties to the Chinese government than, say, Ericsson might have to the Swedish government, or Nokia might have to the Finnish government. That assertion might be justified. But if you look at some of the major US corporates, such as Boeing or Honeywell or Lockheed Martin, these companies are incredibly closely linked to the US military as well, right? So I think you need to take those allegations with a pinch of salt.
Max, give us an idea of, from a perhaps cybersecurity aspect, having a company, whether it's Huawei or others, set up your 5G market. What sort of power or influence does that give that company or the country it originates from over your infrastructure?
Okay, well, I just want to comment very quickly on what Simon was saying about the risk of involving a foreign company into your infrastructure. No matter whether the company is Chinese or from any other company, from any other country, you still have to consider the risk and put some countermeasures in place, because, like I said, this infrastructure could hold a lot of sensitive information. Now, from cybersecurity point of view, if you have a company that can have an overall control over the hardware or the software that is running your network infrastructure, processing the information and the data that is passing through your network, there is a possibility, from a technical point of view, to capture this data, take a copy of it and send it somewhere else. So that is possible from a technical point of view. Now it depends on where you're allowing this company to install their hardware or software. So as we have seen 2 days ago from the decision that has been taken in the UK, Huawei was restricted to non-core parts, which is the parts where we'll process the signals and just pass the information to the core network, which will process the data. Now, that would mitigate the risk, that would mitigate the cybersecurity concerns, but at the same time, over the time, like I think one of your guests said, Simon, that this barriers between non-core and core parts could disappear. We were going through the era of edge computing, making processing near the edge of the network. So it will be very difficult to separate the two parts. And I think a risk assessment and monitoring will be needed routinely in this matter.
Simon, let me bring you back on that. Is some concern not justified, given what Max has said? And when you also keep into consideration, I mean, there is a difference, is there not, between Huawei and some of the other companies? We don't know who all the owners of Huawei are, right? Why? That is a bit different from other companies.
No, I mean, Huawei's been very transparent in opening its books and showing exactly who the owners of the company are. I mean, it's I think about 80,000 employees that own Huawei, and it's invited Western journalists in to show them the shareholders ledger and that sort of thing. So I don't think you can say that there's too much ambiguity there. I'd just like to come back to a point that Max made about the risks. Of course, there are risks involved with operating networks, and Huawei is the first to recognize that, and that's why Huawei was at the very forefront of industry in proposing third-party independent verification almost 10 years ago now in the UK. So the question is not about eliminating risks, because risks can't be eliminated completely. The question is taking such technical measures as to minimize the risks. And the problem is that banning Huawei or banning a vendor on the basis of its country of origin just does nothing to improve network security or minimize the risks, and cybersecurity experts will admit that.
Well, what happened? I'm curious to know. Do you feel that Huawei's offer to bring in third-party intervention or supervision was taken seriously?
You're asking me?
Yes.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the British government does this, the Canadian government does this, the Germans now doing this. This offer was extended to the Australian government and rejected. I mean, you have to understand this imposes a huge cost on the company because the company offers to also foot the bill for this. And this is a cost that Huawei has to bear that its competitors don't. So Ericsson, Nokia, they're not subject to the same level of scrutiny. And what Huawei's been saying is that, well, everybody should be subject to the same level of scrutiny, and this should become the industry standard.
All right, let's take those points to Richard. Is the US concern over Huawei really just security? Or, as perhaps Simon is characterizing it, it's been more than transparent. It's invited even third-party regulation or supervision of what it's doing. Are perhaps commercial interests more at play for the US?
I would say I would agree that they've been transparent. And actually, I went to Huawei headquarters last month, and they gave us a tour in Beijing, and they made that same point that they were happy to undergo any security reviews, and they just want everyone else to bear the same costs and so on. But the challenge is, I don't think, they're clearly that the Trump administration and previous administrations are concerned about U.S. economic competitiveness and tried to push U.S. companies. I think we've seen this very clearly in, for example, arms sales. But in this case, there is no strong U.S. competitor. For whatever reasons, the U.S. broke apart its strongest telecommunications company, AT&T, a while ago, and split it up into Bells, concerned about monopoly, and that sort of took out the possibility of having a giant corporation that would be able to match Huawei in terms of research funds and influencing foreign competitors through just sheer weight of sales and media and so on. So in this case, I think the concern really is security-wise. I mean, if this were a question of dealing just on other markets, I think that, and the U.S. wasn't a strong competitor, you wouldn't see this major concern. But the problem is with 5G, with what we call these dual-use technologies that can have commercial application and are sold as such, but then can also have military security application. It's just a special area, and one advantage that the U.S. has had is strong allies.
The 5G technology industry is forecast by 2035 to generate 22 million jobs and $3 trillion. There are those in the U.S. who say the U.S. should try and make sure it grabs a big piece of that market. Is it not easy to see why governments would want to make sure that Huawei doesn't become the biggest player in that market purely from a dollars and cents perspective?
Sure. So if you're in Finland, Sweden, South Korea, and some other countries, you have a national competitor that you would want to capture that market rather than Huawei. But in the or the other Chinese companies. In the case of the U.S., though, there's not real direct competitor. I would think Google, Apple, and so on are thinking about how they could apply some of their achievements into entering this market. But as you said, the market's going to be so big, there are going to be a lot of players, so it's not a major financial issue. The debate here really has been a U.S. national security strength is that we have close allies, unlike Russia and China and Iran and other countries. We need to sustain these strong alliances, and that involves sustaining the security of our intelligence sharing and therefore limiting the opportunity for non-members of this group to challenge that, disrupt that, access that sensitive information.
Max, according to a 2018 report by Deloitte, China outspent the US by $24 billion when it comes to wireless communication infrastructure since 2015. It has 12 times more 5G base stations. If that is the point we're at, and that is the gap between China and the world's largest economy and superpower, can anyone catch up with Beijing?
It will be actually difficult to see how this gap can be bridged in the near future. I mean, like you said, by 2030, the market will change and it is expected to generate a lot of money. So it's only natural for a lot of governments to start investing in their tech companies and trying to build their power as well in these technologies. Now, I just want to go back to a point Simon was making about eliminating risk. And I agree with him that banning Huawei completely will not eliminate the risk 100%. It only focuses the risk on other parts of the network, because every country would like to run their own. Ideally, they would like to run their own infrastructure, their own network, to make sure they have
Is that at all
control.
Even possible, Max, that each country
again,
can start its own 5G network or even parts of it? Is there an alternative, in other words, to Huawei?
Yeah, unfortunately, this is not possible at the moment. As I said, it is ideal for each country to have that, but it's not possible because we are in a connected world. There is no borders. Companies like Huawei are, like I said, leading in these technologies. Like your guest Richard said, that they've invested a lot of money, and sometimes I always think that it's really difficult to see how would Huawei be involved in spying activities, and they would risk their reputation and losing a big share of markets in the West and everywhere in the world. So it's difficult to see how would they actually risk that reputation, and that explain why they are trying to bring third parties and invite people to go there and see how they are doing or conducting their business.
All right, I think we've just got a minute or so left. Let me bring in Simon for a thought. Given the size of this market we're talking about, given the fact not only that, well, it seems increasingly every aspect of life now depends on technology, but even military strength increasingly is defined by one's technological advancement. Is it possible, Simon, to really deny that there is a very clear geopolitical gain for China in supporting Huawei, despite what the company has said repeatedly, that it doesn't have those close ties and connections and support from the Chinese government?
Look, I mean, I think most senior executives in Huawei would be the last to admit this. But the Chinese government has really taken a couple of steps in the last few years that really made life very difficult for Huawei, such as the 2017 intelligence law and the response to the arrest of the CFO. They've really put Huawei on the back foot. But what I'd like to do just briefly is come back to a point that was made by Richard, in asking why is the US so hostile to Huawei? And I think it goes back to the fact that for several decades now, the US has understood its military advantage, also in terms of its technological leadership, right, under the offset strategy. So if you look at the raison d'etre of the Bureau of Industry and Security of the Department of Commerce, who issued the entities list, it's to maintain US technological leadership. And that's really what this is about, and that's what all these efforts to hobble Huawei in the 5G space are ultimately about.
All right. Interesting discussion, gentlemen. We're out of time. We're going to have to thank you all for your contributions. Let's thank Simon, Max, and Richard. And thank you too for watching. You can see the show again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zeidan, and the whole team here, for now, is goodbye.